So going back to sort of the policy making itself in America, do you want to sort of walk us through the a typical process for some sort of bill or policy that goes through, we'll say Washington for simplicity?
Yeah, sure. So Schoolhouse Rock has a wonderful little cartoon on this process, and will
Absolutely.
probably explain it better than I do. But typically, a representative will write legislation. It will then move to committee. So let's say you're writing space legislation, it'll move to like the space committee. I think it actually hits the subcommittee first, and then it moves, they'll deliberate about it, make changes, move it to the higher level committee, also deliberate about it, make changes. It'll then be scheduled to be brought to the floor, which is just like the General Assembly of the House or the Senate, where it's voted on. And then the other what's the word I'm looking for? The other chamber has to pass like similar legislation. And typically there are differences in the legislation they pass. So they'll just kind of go into a room and work out those differences and then get the bill passed again in each chamber. That then moves to the president, who signs it or vetoes it. So that's a very quick, bare bones, like how legislation in America is made.
So when a representative brings or writes some sort of legislation, you were involved from the standpoint of whether it's citizen lobbying or otherwise, say, hey, we want XYZ policy or legislation, and then that's what kicks off the process usually?
So if you are working on a big enough issue, right? Because then that representative or that committee, whoever's writing the bill in, let's just say the House, has the resources to actually write the bill. It can also happen where if it's a smaller issue, an organization or a corporation will basically just hand a bill to the representative and say, hey, we want this passed.
Does that happen often?
It happens. I am not sure how often it happens.
So
sometimes it can just be like chunks too of legislation, right? Like, hey, there is this specific part of legislation. We want it rewritten this way. Here you go.
And so how does that relationship happen where a corporation can just say, hey, we want here's the rewritten part of your legislation? Like how does that happen from the standpoint of I guess it would have to be a fairly small issue, but
I mean, when you say happens, small, like if you think of healthcare, right? Like the healthcare industry was like, they were definitely trying to make, and I think did make some significant changes to like Obamacare during that process.
And so does that happen because the representatives aren't well versed enough in the technicalities of what's being written, or because they're too busy to read it, or how does that sort of thing happen? And how does that relationship happen where company X actually ends up rewriting that piece of legislation versus company Y?
Sure. So there are a few questions there. So let me try to make sure I hit them all. I will say this is different at the state level. At the state level, I don't have like research to back this up, but I imagine it's much more common for a company to be like, we want this specific thing passed. Here you go. And at the state level, they don't have the same resources that our federal chambers do, our federal legislative bodies do, the House and the Senate. And sometimes you can have one staffer at the state level supporting multiple representatives, right? And so like they don't have the same resources. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's very common at that level for organizations and corporations to just hand them legislation. That said, looking at the federal level, there is a lot that goes into it. I mean, part of it is just building relationships, right? If you're meeting a representative, if you're a lobbyist meeting a representative every month for years, right? You get a rapport with them, and if you frame your corporation in like a good light, then your representatives like might be more likely to help you. They'll also fund studies that might be biased a little bit, right? So that you can hand them a study and be like, hey, look at this study that supports whatever we want. Like I know the fossil fuel industry did this a lot in, I think the 1990s, 1980s, right? Where like they would fund research into climate change that was just completely off base, right? And then they'd use it to be like, hey, climate change isn't actually happening. Why? You guys shouldn't regulate us. Stop it.
Yeah. So there's one more question that comes off it though. You said like the relationship is built over years. I think to me anyways, wouldn't that be part of the problem as to why By the People is a necessary sort of platform? Because if you have a lobbyist that meets that representative for a decade or 2 decades, that would seem to me to be part of the problem anyways.
Yeah. So that is a really good question, right? And that is actually a lot of the power behind By the People, because now people have a way to track their relationship with their elected official, right? And so you can meet with your elected official for a decade and have that relationship. And I mean, you can do that today. It's just
harder.
We're lowering, exactly, right? We're lowering the barriers to actively doing that. And so you get people making these relationships. Ideally, you then have these people who aren't corporate lobbyists influencing policy in a way to maybe combat the corporate interests.
Sure.
And like, I don't know, I don't mean to like totally attack corporate interests. They're fine sometimes, right? But they're interested in their own profits, right? And like, that's not the best incentive, I believe, to run a democracy.
No, definitely not. But also, I don't fault them for being interested in their own profits either. That's what
Absolutely.
they're there to do.
Yeah.
It's interesting that, so from that problem, normally when I think of that problem, I think the first solution that comes to mind for me would be like term limits on congressmen and senators and people like that. Where if you've approached it from the opposite way, which is instead of making congresspeople and senators not be in office that long, you said, well, they're going to be, so why not give normal people the opportunity to build that relationship with them the same way that somebody else would. I think that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that as a solution before, mostly because I didn't have or see the means to do it.
Yeah.
But now it seems that there is one. So it's interesting. It's an interesting sort of, to me at least, it's a little bit outside the box of a solution to that problem.
Well, and sorry, but to go back to that question, I mean, there are also other ways that lobbyists influence representatives, right? It is not uncommon for a representative to retire and then go work for one of the industries that they wrote regulations for, right?
Yeah.
And those regulations happen to help that industry. And then these representatives happen to be making millions of dollars hired by that industry.
Yeah.